Welcome back to POP Podcast, everybody. Hope you're ready to dive deep because today we're going to be talking about some of the most controversial moments in Saturday Night Live history.
You know, for a show that's been on the air for almost 50 years, SNL has really made a name for itself by pushing the envelope and getting people talking.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost like a badge of honor for comedians and musicians, to have had a controversial SNL moment. But here's the thing. What might have seemed outrageous back in the 70s could be totally tame now.
That's so true. SNL really gives us a glimpse into how humor and what we find acceptable has changed over time.
Right. And today we're going to be talking about some of the biggest SNL controversies, from Elvis Costello switching songs at the last minute to Sinead O'Connor's protest and a lot more. We're going to unpack why these events caused such a stir and how they reflect the changing world around us.
We'll be taking you behind the scenes of these controversies, and trust me, some of them are even crazier than you might think.
Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to POP Podcast so you don't miss any of the juicy details.
All right, so let's rewind all the way back to 1975, the very first season of SNL. Just picture a young, kind of cocky Chevy Chase on stage with the one and only Richard Pryor doing this sketch called Word Association.
Ooh, okay. I'm already picturing this going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Chevy Chase was known for pushing buttons even back then. So did he try to outsmart Richard Pryor or something?
Well, the idea was simple enough. You know, Chase is playing a job interviewer, and he's saying words, and Pryor's supposed to respond with the first thing that comes to mind.
Innocent enough, right?
Yeah. But something tells me it took a turn.
Oh, you bet it did. Chase starts using more and more inflammatory language, and then he actually uses the N-word. And remember, this is 1975. Racial tensions were still really high.
I can't believe they let that go out on live television. I mean, even for the 70s, that seems like a big risk. It was a huge shocker. But what's really incredible is Richard Pryor's response. He doesn't even hesitate. He just turns it around on Chase with this super sharp comeback that calls out the racism head on. It was like a masterclass in using comedy to address social problems.
That really speaks to Pryor's comedic genius. To handle something so tense with humor and grace. It must have been an amazing thing to watch.
Absolutely. It kind of set the stage for SNL's willingness to tackle tough topics, even if it meant stirring up controversy.
Wow.
But, they didn't always succeed. Just a year later, in 1976, they had a sketch called the Claudine Longet Invitational. And, well, let's just say it didn't go over very well.
Okay, so for those who don't know who Claudine Longet is, give us a little context. Who was she, and why was this sketch so controversial?
So Longet was this French singer and actress, but in 1976, she was charged with shooting and killing her boyfriend, this famous skier. It was huge news. And SNL, always trying to be topical, and they decided to make a parody out of it.
Oh, I see where this is going. SNL and turning tragedy into comedy. It doesn't always work, does it?
Not this time. The sketch showed Longet accidentally shooting skiers during a competition. They were going for satire, but Longet's lawyers weren't laughing.
I bet they weren't. I'm sure they were ready to sue or something.
They slapped SNL with a cease and desist, basically forcing the show to give their first ever on-air apology. It was a harsh reminder that even SNL has its limits.
That's a good lesson for any comedian, right?
Yeah.
You have to know when a joke goes too far or if something is just too sensitive.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and sometimes SNL falls off the tightrope. But let's be honest, part of the fun is that you never know what's going to happen.
Oh, totally. It's like watching someone on a high wire,
Yeah.
Will they make it or will there be a huge crash?
And speaking of unpredictable, let's fast forward a few years to 1977 and talk about Elvis Costello's infamous act of rebellion.
Oh, yeah. This is one for the books. Elvis Costello, the punk rock icon going rogue on live TV. Tell us what happened.
Okay, so Costello's booked to perform his song Less Than Zero, pretty standard for a musical guest. But right in the middle of the song, he tells his band to stop.
I can just imagine Lorne Michaels in the control room freaking out.
Oh, I'm sure everyone was panicking. But instead of Less Than Zero, Costello starts playing Radio, a song that's basically a big critique of corporate media.
Talk about a power move.
Yeah.
He basically took over SNL to make his own statement.
It was bold and brilliant, and it got him banned from the show for over a decade. It made him a punk legend and added another crazy chapter to SNL history.
So it sounds like SNL can be this place where amazing things happen, even if they mean upsetting some people and going against expectations.
It definitely is. It's a high-risk, high-reward kind of show. Now, before we move on to our next SNL shocker, let me just remind you to hit that subscribe button and share this episode with your friends. We've got a lot more to cover, and you don't want to miss it. And welcome back to POP Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about Elvis Costello and his big SNL rebellion.
It's wild to think that something as simple as changing a song could cause so much trouble. But I guess it shows how much power the network really has, right? It's like
Yeah.
this battle between artistic freedom and what they'll let you get away with.
Absolutely. And that tension, it played out with other musical acts too, sometimes with even more explosive results. Like a few years later in 1981, SNL had this punk band called Fear on, and it basically turned into total chaos.
Oh yeah, I've heard stories about this one. It's legendary for being one of the craziest SNL moments ever. Weren't they banned from the show for life?
They were. It's one of those things you kind of had to see to believe, but the stories are insane.
So set the scene for us. What exactly happened?
Well, John Belushi was a huge punk rock fan, and he really pushed for SNL to book Fear. He even helped fill the audience with actual punk fans, people who knew how to mosh and slam dance.
I can only imagine the energy in that studio. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was pure punk rock mayhem. The band was super loud and aggressive, and they were telling the audience to go wild. Stage diving mosh pits, the whole shebang.
Did they actually cause any damage to the set?
Oh, yeah. There were reports of damage to the stage instruments getting smashed, even a pumpkin being thrown into the crowd. It was like something straight out of a punk rock movie.
Yeah, I can see why Lorne Michaels might have been a little upset after that one.
Upset might be putting it mildly. Fear was banned from SNL right then and there. But hey, they made punk rock history, right?
They definitely left their mark.
Yeah.
It just goes to show that sometimes the most memorable SNL moments are the ones that break all the rules.
Okay, so let's jump ahead to the 90s, a decade that had more than its share of SNL controversies. In 1992, Nirvana took the stage, and, well, they didn't exactly hold back.
Nirvana. Kurt Cobain, the grunge icon, and his band.
Yeah.
They weren't exactly known for being well-behaved.
They were known for their raw energy and crazy performances, and their SNL appearance was no different. They finished their set by smashing their instruments, which was pretty typical for Nirvana at that point. But it was what they did during the curtain call that really crossed the line.
I'm intrigued. What happened?
Well, the band members decided to have a little makeout session on stage. Chris Novoselic, the drummer, was kissing both Kurt Cobain and Dave Grohl.
Wow. That's a pretty big statement even for a band that was known for pushing boundaries.
Yeah, it was a definite act of rebellion. A way to challenge people's ideas about sexuality and homophobia.
But I bet NBC was not thrilled about it.
You're right, they actually edited the kisses out of all the reruns.
It's crazy how something that seems so normal now could cause such a big deal back then. It really shows how much progress we've made with LGBTQ acceptance, but also how much further we still have to go.
And on that note, we can't talk about SNL controversies without talking about Sinead O'Connor's legendary protest in 1992.
Oh, man. That was one for the history books. I remember watching it live and being absolutely shocked. It was like all the air got sucked out of the room. What was it like being there in the studio?
It was electric. You could feel the tension building. O'Connor was performing a cappella version of Bob Marley's War, which is a powerful song on its own. But then at the very end, she holds up this photo of Pope John Paul II.
And she rips it up.
She tears it to shreds while staring straight into the camera and says, "Fight the real enemy." The whole studio went silent. You could have heard a pin drop.
Chills just thinking about it. She was protesting the Catholic Church covering up sexual abuse scandals, right? Something that people were just starting to talk about openly.
Exactly. She used SNL, one of the biggest stages in the world, to draw attention to this really serious problem that was being swept under the rug. It was a brave thing to do, and of course it sparked a huge backlash.
They banned her from SNL for life, didn't they?
They did. But her protest made headlines around the world and forced people to face the reality of abuse in the church. Whether you agree with how she did it or not, there's no denying that she had a huge impact.
It's a reminder that SNL isn't just about making people laugh. It can be a platform for social change, for artists to speak out against injustice.
And sometimes those challenges come in the form of pure, unadulterated comedy, the kind that makes you laugh so hard you can barely breathe and wonder how they got away with it.
So true. And speaking of pushing the limits of comedy, we've got a whole bunch of other outrageous SNL moments to unpack.
Before we dive into those, let me just remind you to hit that like button and subscribe to POP Podcast so you don't miss any of the fun. We'll be back with more behind-the-scenes stories and jaw-dropping moments from SNL history.
And welcome back to POP Podcast, everyone. We've been talking about some of the most controversial moments in SNL history. And wow, it's been a wild ride so far.
Yeah, before the break, we were just talking about Sinead O'Connor and her big protest. It really shows you how SNL can be a platform for serious issues, you
Yeah.
know. But of course, it's also famous for its outrageous comedy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Sometimes the humor is so over the top, it makes you wonder how they even got away with it.
Well, one sketch that definitely falls into that category is the infamous Canteen Boy sketch from 1994 with Alec Baldwin.
Ooh, yeah, I remember this one. Didn't it have something to do with the Boy Scouts?
It did. The sketch had Adam Sandler playing Canteen Boy, this kind of clueless Boy Scout leader, and Alec Baldwin was the scoutmaster who had, well, let's just say an unusual interest in Canteen Boy.
Okay, yeah. I can see why that one would have been controversial. It sounded like they were playing with some pretty sensitive stuff.
Definitely. The sketch was criticized for making light of pedophilia, and it got a lot of backlash from the Boy Scouts of America.
I bet they weren't too happy about that portrayal. Did SNL ever address the controversy?
They didn't really apologize, but the sketch definitely started a conversation about where the line is when it comes to humor, especially with a topic like child abuse.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Mm.
Humor can be a good way to deal with tough issues,
Mm.
but it's a fine line between satire and just being offensive.
And SNL has definitely crossed that line a few times, like Martin Lawrence's monologue in 1994, for example.
Yeah, he got banned from the show after that, right?
Yeah, he did. Lawrence's monologue was all about feminine hygiene, which was considered way too vulgar for network TV back then.
I can only imagine how that went over with the NBC execs.
Not well at all. They thought it was way too crude, and Lawrence was banned from SNL and any other NBC show for good.
Wow, they really took that seriously.
Mhm.
Makes you wonder, did they give him any warning, or did they just let him go for it and hope for the best?
That's the thing about SNL, it's live, so anything can happen.
And sometimes the most unexpected things happen during the musical performances, like when Ashley Simpson was caught lip-syncing in 2004.
Oh man, that was a classic SNL disaster. You could see the panic on her face when the wrong vocals started
It
playing.
was almost like a dream. You know,
Jay?
she tried to cover it up by doing this weird little dance, but it was too late.
It went viral instantly and pretty much ended her music career.
It just goes to show that in the age of social media, an SNL mess-up can really come back to bite you.
And speaking of viral moments, who could forget Jenny Slate dropping the F-bomb during her first ever SNL appearance in 2009?
Oh, yeah, that was a shocker. It just slipped out during a sketch, and you could tell she was mortified.
It was definitely awkward. It also shows you how risky live TV can be. You can rehearse all you want, but there's always a chance for things to go wrong.
And SNL is like the king of unexpected moments. It's part of what keeps us coming back for more.
And speaking of things that keep us coming back, let's talk about SNL and politics. It's been a source of controversy for decades.
Oh, for sure. SNL has never been afraid to get political, even if it means making some powerful people angry. Like when Rage Against the Machine tried to protest Steve Forbes during their performance in 1996.
Yeah, they hung American flags upside down on their amps, which did not go over well with the SNL producers. They were kicked off the show and never invited back.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
It's interesting how SNL can become this battleground for different political views.
And sometimes those battles play out in the most unexpected ways, like when Donald Trump hosted SNL in 2015.
Oh yeah, that was a big one. It felt like everyone was either furious or completely amused.
It was huge for SNL's ratings, but it also caused a lot of protests and boycotts. It showed just how divisive Trump was even before he became president.
It's amazing to think back on all these moments, and see how they reflect what was going on in the world at the time. SNL is like this living history of our culture.
It's a show that's always pushing the boundaries, testing what people are willing to accept, and starting conversations that need to happen. And that's why, even after all these years, we just can't get enough of it.
I totally agree. It's this cultural phenomenon that reflects all the good and bad and funny and confusing parts of who we are.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the most controversial SNL moments, we're left with a lot to think about. Where do we draw the line with humor? How has SNL shaped our culture? And what will the next 50 years of SNL bring?
Those are some great questions for you listeners out there to think about. And speaking of listeners, don't forget to like and subscribe to POP Podcast for more deep dives into the world of pop culture.
We're always here to break down the biggest stories, dig up the juiciest gossip, and get you thinking. So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay entertained.